On August 23, 1944, 6 American soldiers stood waist-deep in a warm Pacific lagoon on Pegan Island, firing backward into a tree line full of Japanese riflemen. Arisaka rounds snapped over the water from 3 directions. The garrison on this island numbered close to 200 men. The American patrol numbered 6. Private First Class Harry Whalen braced his Browning automatic rifle against his hip and raked the jungle in controlled bursts. Sergeant Lawrence Coleman swept the left flank with an M3 grease gun. Lieutenant Robert Sumner stood on the exposed dune line, back-to-back with Private Edward Reynolds, drawing fire so the rest of the team could reach the rubber boat. Then an Australian bow fighter screamed overhead at 30 yards off the ground. 6.50 caliber machine guns and 2 20mm cannons hammering the shore. The PT boats behind them opened up with 20mm, 40mm, and 3 inches guns. Not one of those 6 Americans was hit. They boarded a PT boat, the Coast Guard frigate shelled the island, and the team vanished back across the Pacific. A few nights later, Tokyo Rose announced on Radio Tokyo that Imperial Marines had repulsed an Allied attack on the Mapia Islands with losses. She was half right. There were losses. They were all Japanese. Those 6 men belonged to a unit so secret that the Japanese never identified it, never captured a member, and never recovered a body. Across 106 verified missions behind enemy lines, this unit killed over 500 Japanese troops, captured 84 more for interrogation, and liberated over 700 Allied prisoners of war. And they did all of it without losing a single man in combat during the entire war. They were called the Alamo Scouts, and on Pegan Island, Japan learned the hard way what happened when you try to hunt them. It was late November 1943, and Lieutenant General Walter Kruger had a problem he could no longer ignore. Kruger commanded the 6th Army in the Southwest Pacific, the force General Douglas MacArthur designated Alamo Force, after Kruger's long association with Fort Sam Houston in San Antonio, Texas. The 6th Army was tasked with island hopping across New Guinea and into the Philippines. Every landing required intelligence about what was waiting on the beach, and that intelligence kept failing. At Kiska in the Aleutians that August, the Allies had launched a full-scale invasion of an island the Japanese had already abandoned. Thousands of troops stormed empty beaches because nobody confirmed the enemy was still there. At Cape Gloucester on New Britain, inadequate reconnaissance preceded the landings again, and the Navy's amphibious scouts, the unit supposed to be gathering this intelligence, had returned 11 days late from one mission and then been held another 4 days by Navy intelligence officers for debriefing. Their commander finally jumped ship and literally swam to Kruger's headquarters out of frustration. Kruger needed his own people, men who answered to him, moved on his timeline, and reported directly to 6th Army G2. On November 28, 1943, he signed General Order 353B and created the Alamo Scouts Training Center on Ferguson Island, a remote jungle outpost in the D'Entrecasteaux Group off eastern New Guinea. His first training center director was Lieutenant Colonel Frederick Bradshaw, a civilian attorney from Jackson, Mississippi, who had impressed Kruger during the Louisiana maneuvers. The concept was radical for 1943. 6 to 7-man teams, named after their team leader, inserted by PT boat or submarine up to 14 days before a major landing. Their job was to observe enemy positions, count troops, map beaches, and radio everything back. If they were compromised, there would be no reinforcement. No rescue helicopter because those didn't exist yet. No extraction unless the PT boats could reach them. Every detail of the selection process was designed around that reality. Roughly 700 men volunteered across the war. Only about 138 became operational scouts. 40% of trainees washed out in the first 2 weeks of a 6-week course that included jungle navigation, rubberboat handling in heavy surf, hand-to-hand combat, demolitions, radio operation, and long-range reconnaissance techniques. The men who survived the course then did something no other military unit did. They voted on who they wanted beside them. Every trainee secretly listed the officers and enlisted men he most wanted to deploy with. The teams that formed were built on trust that already existed before the first mission. A lieutenant led each one. 6 or 7 men total. Small enough to disappear into dense jungle, large enough to rotate security watches, and still send a forward observation element ahead. The scouts were not, as Kruger himself put it, cutthroats and toughs. They were chosen because they could think, move silently, and stay invisible for days at a time on islands crawling with Japanese soldiers. The first test of that doctrine came on February 27, 1944, at Los Negros Island in the Admiralties. Lieutenant John McGowan's six-man team was inserted by PBY Catalina, flying boat 48 hours before the planned 1st Cavalry Division reconnaissance in force. The planners believed the Japanese might have already evacuated. McGowan's team crept to within 15 feet of Japanese positions in the dark and radioed back a message that became legend inside 6th Army headquarters. The area southwest of Momot airstrip, they reported, was lousy with Japs. The garrison was an estimated 4,000 to 5,000 troops, not evacuated, waiting. That single radio transmission changed the invasion plan. The landing shifted to lightly defended Haiane Bay instead of the original target. The PBY pilot who extracted them refused to slow down, and the team had to abandon their rubber boat, scrambling aboard a moving aircraft. McGowan was taken directly to the task force commander. The Alamo scouts had proven their concept with one mission. Over the following months, teams fanned out across New Guinea and the surrounding islands, inserting by PT boat under cover of darkness, paddling rubber rafts through surf, and spending days hidden in jungle so thick you couldn't see your hand in front of your face. They carried M1 carbines with 75 rounds, 2 fragmentation grenades, for smoke grenades split among the team, an SCR, 300 radio, and 2 days of K rations. Light, fast, and quiet. That was the doctrine. If you're getting value from this one, hit subscribe. We cover stories like this every week. Now, the scouts could gather intelligence. Los Negros proved that. The question became whether they could fight when the mission demanded it. On October 4, 1944, 2 scout teams got their answer at Cape Oransbury on the Vogelkop Peninsula of New Guinea. Nellis' team and Roundsville team had learned from a Dutch liaison officer that a governor and his family were being held by the Japanese at a small coastal village. Both teams, plus Lieutenant Jack Dove, inserted by PT boat under a full moon, and began a 6.5-hour night march through jungle so dark they taped flashlights to the ends of their weapons just to see behind enemy lines using flashlights. That was the kind of calculated risk these men lived inside. At 0410, Lieutenant Roundsville opened fire on the main Japanese barracks hut. Phosphorus grenades went through the windows. The assault on the village lasted 3 minutes. At least 10 Japanese were killed in the barracks. Sergeants Andy Smith and Sabas Assis, music, hit a second hut housing 5 Kempeitai military police officers and freed a native chief. Nellis' team neutralized a guard post 2.5 miles east, killing 4 sentries and capturing a British and a Japanese machine gun. 66 Dutch and Javanese civilians, plus a French family with 10 children, were extracted to safety. 18 Japanese dead. 0 American casualties. The scouts had just pulled off the first hostage rescue in their history. And then, there was the moment that cracked things open. Private First Class Rufo Vacular walked into one of the smoldering huts where Andy Smith had found a captured gramophone and was playing a Bing Crosby record. Behind Smith, a Japanese soldier with a fixed bayonet was creeping forward in the dark. Vacular raised his weapon and fired past Smith's head, less than a foot from his ear, and killed the Japanese soldier behind him. That's who these men were. The kind of calm that doesn't come from training alone. O'Hare's body proved the scouts could execute offensive operations. 3 months later, they would be asked to do something far more dangerous and far more consequential. In late January 1945, the Japanese were retreating across Luzon in the Philippines. Behind their lines at a prisoner of war camp near the town of Cabanatuan, over 500 Allied POWs, many of them survivors of the Bataan Death March, were starving and dying. American intelligence feared the Japanese would execute the prisoners before they could be liberated. It had happened before. 6th Army tasked 2 Alamo scout teams to reconnoiter the camp and guide a Ranger assault force in. On January 27th, Lieutenant Bill Nellis and Private First Class Rufo Vacular, the same man who had saved Andy Smith's life at O'Hare's body, disguised themselves as Filipino rice farmers. Straw hats, farmers' clothing. They walked to a nipa hut 200 yards north of the prison gate, within direct line of sight of the Japanese guard towers, and stayed there for over 2 hours. plotting Japanese positions on an aerial photograph, counting guards, marking machine gun emplacements. 3 more scouts later crawled to the same hut to serve as runners. Lieutenant Dove carried the marked photograph by native pony to Lieutenant Colonel Henry Mucci's 6th Ranger Battalion at Platero. On the night of January 30th, the raid went in. 2 5-man scout teams, C and F companies of the 6th Ranger Battalion, and roughly 280 Filipino guerrillas under Captains Juan Pajota and Eduardo Josen. AP-61 Black Widow night fighter buzzed the camp as a distraction. The raid lasted under 30 minutes. 516 Allied prisoners of war walked out of Cabanatuan alive that night. An estimated 530 or more Japanese were killed. 2 Rangers were killed in action. Lieutenant Rounceville took mortar shrapnel in his backside and reportedly told Nellist with characteristic humor that he needed Bill to come look at his injury. Technical Sergeant Alfonso was hit in the abdomen. 0 scouts killed. 6th Army's weekly G2 report, Music, called it an almost perfect example of prior reconnaissance and planning. The publicity from Cabanatuan finally blew the scouts' cover. For the first time, the American public learned that a small, unnamed unit had been operating deep behind Japanese lines across the entire Pacific Theater. The numbers, when you line them up, are almost hard to believe. 106 verified reconnaissance missions behind Japanese lines. 1,482 total days spent in the field. Over 500 Japanese killed directly by scout teams. 84 enemy soldiers captured and brought back for interrogation. 713 Allied prisoners of war and civilians liberated. 118 combat decorations, including 44 Silver Stars, 33 Bronze Stars, and 2 Presidential Unit citations. And through all of it, across every island, every jungle, every lagoon where the enemy tried to find them, 0 Alamo scouts killed in action. 0 captured. To understand how extraordinary that is, consider the comparison. Merrill's Marauders in Burma suffered over 80% casualties. The 1st Special Service Force lost 134% of its combat strength in 251 days. The Alamo Scouts operated for nearly 500 days in the field, deep behind Japanese lines, in 6-man teams with no extraction guarantee, and brought every single man home alive. The Japanese never even figured out what they were. No scout body was ever recovered by the enemy. No scout sat across a Japanese interrogation table. Tokyo couldn't connect the dots between the small parties landing on their islands because there was nothing to connect. The scouts left behind intelligence reports, not evidence. The unit was disbanded in November 1945 in Kyoto, Japan, without ceremony or parade. The men went home to farms in Iowa, law practices in Mississippi, and civilian lives that never mentioned what they had done. But the legacy didn't end there. In 1950, Lieutenant Rafael Ileto, a Filipino-American who had led his own Alamo Scout team, took the doctor home and founded the Philippine Army's 1st Scout Ranger Regiment. In Vietnam, long-range surveillance units modeled themselves directly on the Scout concept. The peer evaluation selection methods the Scouts pioneered became the backbone of U.S. Army Special Forces qualification. And in 1988, surviving Alamo Scouts, most of them in their 70s by then, were called to Fort Bragg. The John F. Kennedy Special Warfare Center awarded them the Special Forces tab, formally recognizing what those men had always been, the ancestors of the Green Berets. One man among them connected that thread across 2 wars. Galen Kittleson was a 19-year-old Iowa farm boy when he earned a Silver Star with the 503rd Parachute Infantry Regiment on November 4th. He volunteered for the Alamo Scouts. He went into Cabanatuan. He went into O'Donnell Barracks. After the war, he joined Special Forces. In 1970, at the age of 46, he beat out Green Berets half his age to serve as assault element leader on the Son Tay prison camp raid in North Vietnam. The only American soldier to participate in 4 prisoner-of-war rescue attempts across 2 wars. Sometimes the right 6 men in the right place with the right training and the right discipline matter more than a division. The Alamo Scouts understood that before anyone had a name for special operations. And somewhere in the archives of Radio Tokyo, there is a broadcast from August 1944 where a woman with a silky voice told the Pacific Fleet that Imperial Marines had repulsed an Allied attack on the Mapia Islands. She never mentioned the 6 Americans who walked away clean. If you want to see another story about small units doing impossible things behind enemy lines, that video is on screen now.